All right, so let's begin with the Luke 7 text. The article, the Schwab article, draws attention specifically to Luke 7:36 to 39, but the story really does not end there. The story extends out past that to the end of the chapter. And so I'm probably going to make some comment about the rest of that. I think it's appropriate, and I think it could be helpful for us as we think about our own spirituality, as we think about our ethics, as we think about how Jesus himself informs that, how his conversation with the players in this particular story, how that all comes together. So, who are the players? Well, essentially there are three. There is this Pharisee, right? He's identified for us in verse 36 as just one of the Pharisees, and then later on, Jesus calls him by name, Simon. All right, so that's actually later in the chapter that Jesus does that, and that's all we know about this particular Pharisee. If you remember, we talked about the Pharisees. We talked about their view of resurrection, and we talked about how they had a particular kind of political point of view. And if you know much about the Gospels, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or if you are interested now and you're starting to read the Gospels, you'll see that the Pharisees and Jesus sometimes come to real loggerheads. There is contention in the relationship, probably a little bit more evident in the Gospel of Matthew than it is in Mark or Luke, but you'll see it there as well. So you've got this Pharisee named Simon. You have Jesus himself, and it would appear that there are some other folks kind of milling about this particular dinner. It doesn't seem to be totally private, and it's kind of the practice. And Schwab does a good job, I think, of drawing attention to the importance of hospitality as a means of talking about the immigration debate. I think hospitality might be something that nurses have to be aware of as well. What that looks like for you and what it looks like for me in the classroom might be a little bit different, but certainly there would be some commonalities there. And then we have this woman who is unnamed, although scholars think it may be Mary Magdalene, but this woman is unnamed here in this text. The way biblical writers name or don't name individuals can tell us something about, at least we think it tells us something about their perspective, about the role that these particular individuals play in the narrative. It may tell us something about who's marginalized and who's not in the narratives or in that particular historical context. But naming and not naming, just pay attention to it when you're reading really anything. It can be true of modern poetry, for example, but it's certainly true of the New Testament. It's certainly true of the Old Testament as well. So these are the players, and Jesus is asked to come to dinner. Now, as you read the text, one of the things that you'll notice is that that Jesus is reclining at the table. So very often what would happen, just as I'm kind of leaning over here on my left elbow right now, I might have my feet extended out this way. I'm leaning into the table, grabbing something to eat and bringing it to my mouth, grabbing something to eat and bringing it to my mouth. Now, Simon might be, right over here wanting to talk to me. Well, he's leaning on his right elbow, and we're facing each other, and we're sharing a meal this way. And in comes this woman. Jesus' feet are out, he's stretched out on this kind of reclining couch, again, on his elbow, getting something to eat. And she comes in, and she begins to, wash his feet with her tears. So one of the things that the Jesuit sense of spirituality emphasizes, the Jesuits founded by Ignatius Loyola in the 16th century, is this idea of placing yourself in the text. And so here's a place where I have placed myself in the text. You know, how many tears would one have to cry to wash someone's feet? So I'm not sure that crying really describes it well. I'm not even sure weeping describes it well. I mean, it would be, you know, the prophet Jeremiah says that, oh, that my head were a fountain of tears, so much is he in lament. It would be sobbing, it seems to me. It would be uncontrollable crying. And, you know, you all would know better than I what the physiology of tears would be like. How, you know, what kind of state does somebody have to be in for their body to generate so many tears? So that's one thing. I kind of place myself into that text. I just wonder about those tears. And we know something about this woman because she's described as a sinner in verses 37 and 39. We're not really told what the sin is, though it probably is reasonable to think that she was of some kind of compromised class, maybe prostitution. That's probably the thing that comes most easily to mind. We're told, you know, this about her at the end. So we have this delayed identification. We have a woman that is not named. She's called a sinner, some kind of compromised morality going on there. And even that serves to, you know, is the writer, at least I say it serves to, but this is my question, is Luke trying to show us just how marginalized she is? But notice what happens here in the middle of verses 37 and 39. In verse 38, Jesus accepts her, right? And that acceptance is powerful. It humanizes someone who has in some ways been dehumanized, or has, maybe dehumanized is not the right word, but has lost some sense of their own humanity and their own dignity. We talked about dignity and respect last week. Here's someone who's lost some of that, and Jesus, in verse 38, accepts her offering. Now the thing that's interesting, you know, Simon, again, he's not named at this point either, but in verse 39, he's like, man, this Jesus, he doesn't even know who this woman is. What's wrong with him? And he's a prophet. And Jesus, as you see, as you go on through the text, through the end of the chapter, Jesus just kind of enters into that. That's the way Luke is portraying Jesus' dialogue with Simon at this point. Simon doesn't say it aloud. Jesus understands his attitude, and that, you know, that tells us something about the way Luke is portraying Jesus as the Son of God. But Jesus enters into dialogue and, you know, critiques Simon's actions, because Jesus said, look, you know, you did not allow me to wash my feet. Remember, this context, they're walking around in sandals or the kind of shoes that would easily, if they had shoes, rather suspect Jesus didn't, but the kind of shoes that would easily still allow the filth of public sewage to get all over the feet. And this picture of what this woman does is really much more graphic than the way we read it in the New Testament. Jesus' feet were not just, you know, they hadn't been in nice shoes like we wear every day. They were not maybe just a little stinky, right? They were dirty. And this is what everyone did. And the first thing you do when you enter the house is you wash your feet. You're given the opportunity to wash your feet. And so what Jesus is saying to Simon is, you neglected me, but she didn't, right? And so one of the things that I think that's happening in this text as well is just this conversation between who's the insider and who's the outsider. And the New Testament, really the scriptures as a whole, but the New Testament is really good about kind of doing these reversals. You see that in all kinds of literature, actually, but New Testament, the Old Testament, I'm probably most familiar with that. These reversals happen with some regularity. And so it makes me look at this text and say, well, this woman, she's really the insider, though she starts out in the narrative as the outsider. And Simon, who has all the indications of being the insider, demonstrates through his actions, through his thoughts that Jesus, understands, that he's kind of an outsider. He doesn't get it. So I look at this text and I said, well, who's the insider in my context? Who's the outsider in my context? How am I perpetuating insider, outsider? And as I think about this focus on provision 2 this week, and I think about how you all are called to place the patient, their family, their community, place that all at the center of care. I am feeling a little bit like, man, do I do that? Do I demonstrate through my actions, through my words, a kind of openness to the other, placing them at the center of my span of care? And that's something that I get out of this Luke passage. One of the ways in which I think it's really important for us to think about in relation to nursing care and in relation to care, period. So we'll come back in just a few minutes and we'll talk a little bit more, probably several sections, on the Good Samaritan.